That's pretty bad. On the article.
Kia ora koutou. Hopefully, Michael,
No.
can you hear me is the question. You can? Oh, good. Thank you. Kia ora koutou. Inga iwi, inga mana, inga hoa mahi, tēnā koutou katoa. E mihi ana kia koutou, kua tai mai ki te tautoko, tēnei kaupapa. Nā mihi nui kia Dr. Patrick Nolan, to te kaikorero o te rā, tēnā koe. Ko Kieran Fowley toko ingoa, no mai haere mai ki te tai ohanga. So thank you everybody for making it here today on this freezing cold day. I think if it wasn't raining, it would probably be snowing at the moment. It's really wonderful that you can all join us in person, but also the people online for this next one of our Treasury Guest Lecture series. The theme at the moment, as you know, is fiscal policy for the future. And once again, a really warm welcome to Dr. Patrick Nolan for coming and joining us. He's not a stranger to Treasury, so we're very grateful when we can get people back to present to us on really important and topical issues like this one. Before we kick things off for people in the room, I just need to run through a quick health and safety briefing. So in the event of a fire alarm, please follow Treasury staff to the nearest exit and progress down the stairwell to evacuate the building. Don't use the lifts. And in the event of an earthquake, do your toodle, drop cover hold, stay in the building until instructed to leave by a warden. Thank you. And anyone who needs the bathrooms, they can be found to the left-hand side of the kitchenette. So if you walk straight ahead after exiting the rooms, you'll see them just sitting there. So about the theme of today's seminar series. So the current theme is exploring the role of stabilising sustainable and effective fiscal policy. We've chosen this theme because it is resilient and sustainable fiscal policy is very much essential to maintain and raise living standards for all New Zealanders. And our guest speakers continue to provide a wide range of insights into how fiscal policy can be designed to support government to meet its current and future obligations, while also adapting to changing circumstances and delivering value to the New Zealand public. And we all know that those circumstances are changing very rapidly in the world we're operating in today as well. We are delighted to have Patrick with us today. He leads a team that supports the Retirement Commissioner to shape their policy and research work and activities. His work includes overseeing the Commission's research program and the statutory 3-yearly review of retirement income policies. And he has held roles in organisations including the New Zealand Treasury, Productivity Commission, NZIER, and also in London in a London-based think tank. Today he'll share with us his early findings of the research he's been undertaking, or his team's been undertaking, to inform the current review of retirement income policies. Ensuring our retirement income remains fair, sustainable and inclusive and fit for purpose is one of the most significant challenges and opportunities we face as a country, and it's very relevant to the work that Treasury is now doing on its long-term fiscal statement, which explores the long-term fiscal impacts of population ageing, but also other matters, and the choices available to successive governments to return to a fiscally sustainable path over the long term. So please keep an eye out for our next long-term fiscal statement. There's one every 4 years, and the next one is due for release in September. And today, Patrick will talk us through how the context for retirement income policy is changing, gaps in coverage in the current system, the role KiwiSaver and other savings play, and also how policy changes can be made safely. So very much thinking about the transition to a more sustainable settings. And I'm very much looking forward to hearing from you today, Patrick. I'm just in terms of the logistics, I'll now hand over to Patrick to deliver his presentation. That'll be followed by a discussion and Q&A. There'll be questions from the room, and there'll also be questions online. We'll use the QA function in Teams, so please post your questions there. And if you have any technical queries, please use the standard chat function, because we have our A team sitting in the back room to help us with all of that too. So thank you very much to everybody who has done a lot to organise these seminars, including Anna, who does a wonderful job throughout the year in terms of organising our CPLS. So over to you, Patrick, and very much welcome again.
Well, thanks, Kieran, and thank you, everyone, and particularly to the team who pulled these series of lectures together. I've really been enjoying this series of guest lectures on fiscal policy for the future. I agree. I think it's a very important topic, and I think it's really great we're doing this. And I'm really pleased that this session on retirement income policy is part of the program. This is an issue that's only going to become more important. The fact I like to use at the start of talks like these is that in the next few years, New Zealand will reach 1 million people aged over 65. That's a big milestone, and it raises some big questions. It will not only impact on retirement income policy, but will have implications in areas like housing, health, and aged care. So you can expect to see a lot more of the issues that we're discussing today going forward. So these are just going to become increasingly central to policy. Now, I think a key thing to bear in mind is, to paraphrase a famous quote, is to treat population aging as an opportunity, not a problem to be solved. However, we do need to recognise that change is going to come whether we prepare for it or not. And as Michael Cullen wrote, we should not leave to our children and our grandchildren harder choices than we are prepared to make ourselves. So what could these choices involve? And what could success look like? So, as a thought experiment, I want you to imagine we're moving forward 25 years, and we're in the year 2050, and we're looking back over the last 25 years. What is it that we wish that we wish we had have done, and how do we want the world to look? Did we reduce hardship, especially for older renters and asset-poor households? Did we keep health and aged care services responsive while maintaining a sustainable budget? Did we achieve fairness across gender, ethnicity, and generations? Did households save enough in order to remain resilient and also support capital markets? And importantly, did people trust the system so that they could plan with confidence? Now, these are all big questions, and to me, they highlight the importance of good quality research and open debate, which leads nicely to the next review of retirement income policy. So these are reviews that we do every 3 years at the Commission, and they're required by statute, and we always take a system-wide perspective. We look across New Zealand Super, KiwiSaver, private savings, and the wider supports that older New Zealanders rely upon. We aim to publish evidence, we publish options, and we explain trade-offs in ways that people can follow. The goal is to try and build consensus that lasts beyond any single budget cycle. Now, this is especially important for retirement income policy, which is an area that needs a long-term perspective and stable policy settings. When we are asking people to make decisions like saving for retirement, we're asking them to think about the long term. So stability and transparency in policy are essential. Before we get into the discussion, it's useful to define what we're talking about, or what the key components of New Zealand's retirement income system are. And there are several linked parts, and you'll know all of these, but it's useful to just go through what they are. First of all, KiwiSaver. As you know, I hope you all know, it's a voluntary workplace scheme with contributions from individuals, employers, and the government. We also have other private savings, and here I think iwi saving schemes are especially interesting, and I'll be talking about those later. We have an unusual tax treatment of savings in New Zealand. This follows a TTE approach, where contributions and earnings are taxed, but withdrawals are free. We have New Zealand Super, which is kind of the key pillar of our retirement income system. It's a universal tax-funded payment from 65, indexed to wages and prices, and easy to understand. And we also have additional support such as the accommodation supplement, disability allowance, and special needs grants. And these really matter for people facing high housing costs or low incomes. And finally, we have the New Zealand Super Fund, which pre-funds part of the future costs to ease some fiscal pressures later. Now, I think this architecture has served us pretty well in New Zealand. If you look across the world, our system does stand out as being very coherent, and it's relatively cost effective. But the world of retirement is changing, and so we can't treat these settings as being set in stone. Now, it's also worth taking another step further back and asking, why do we have these retirement income policies in the first place? What do they aim to achieve? The first reason is to try and smooth incomes across the life course so that people can maintain a reasonable standard of living when paid work tapers off. They also can protect against financial risks that individuals cannot manage alone, what we call longevity risk, because we don't know how long we're going to live for, so you don't know how long your savings need to last. Inflation and market swings can also have an impact here. Now, this risk pooling role is increasingly important as retirement income systems transition to putting more focus on defined contribution schemes like KiwiSaver, which will shift more risk onto individuals. Also, not everyone can save enough to have a decent retirement. They may have low incomes during working lives or have broken contribution histories. These policies can thus also reduce poverty by providing a basic floor. And finally, they can support social cohesion and trust. So given all of that, how does the current system perform? Well, I want to start off by looking at this qualitative work that we've done at the Commission on Older People's Voices. Now, this shows that lived experience is diverse. Retirement is no longer a single tidy phase. In fact, about 1 in 7 people over 65 and over don't even describe themselves as being retired. Now, we know that based on this research, 56% of people, retired people, describe their financial situation as comfortable or very comfortable. 32% are neither poor nor comfortable, and that leaves about 12% who describe their financial situation as poor or very poor. It also highlights the importance of New Zealand super. About 39% rely on it alone as their only source of income, and an additional 34% get at least 2/3 of their income from it. This work also shows that confidence in financial security is uneven. While some retirees feel comfortable, others, particularly renters and people without assets, express deep uncertainty. Now, this isn't just about income levels, it's about resilience. One-off costs like home repairs or unexpected bills can cause significant stress, especially when savings are limited. And housing stands out as a major factor. For renters, the risk of hardship is much higher than for mortgage-free homeowners. This reflects not just affordability, but also stability and control over living conditions. It's a reminder that retirement income policy cannot be separated from housing policy. We also see rising debt levels among older people. Some carry mortgages or consumer debt into retirement, which can add pressure if you're on a fixed income. And additional supports, and while additional supports like the accommodation supplement exist, we know that take-up is uneven. Many older people don't apply, perhaps due to stigma, complexity, or uncertainty in dealing with work and income. Now let's shift from qualitative insights to the quantitative data, and this is from work that's been done by Treasury's excellent analytics and insights team, and actually will be in an article that'll be coming out in Policy Quarterly later this month. And again, it shows very similar messages. Again, the key message here is that older New Zealanders are not a single group. There's significant financial variation in financial well-being, and one of the strongest dividing lines is housing. Owning a home versus renting has a profound impact on security, choices, and overall well-being. Homeowners, especially those who are mortgage-free, tend to have more financial stability, lower housing costs, and greater flexibility. Renters, on the other hand, often face higher costs, less stability, and more financial stress. We also see that transfers to older people are substantial, and so this is based on work that Todd and Hen did, again in the Analytics and Insight team on fiscal incidents. And people aged 65 and over receive much more in public support than they pay in taxes, about $13 billion annually. Now, that's no surprise, is it, really, when you've got a welfare system which takes a broader life cycle approach, where the goal of public spending is to support people who are younger and older. But as work from NZIR has shown, whether this level of support can be sustained depends on the government's overall fiscal position. When governments run surpluses, they can effectively build up savings and pass on benefits to future generations. But when deficits return, it means future taxpayers may have to cover more of the cost, potentially through higher taxes or reduced services. And another change that's worth recognising, as shown in the figures, there's been a striking change in the rise in labour force participation of people aged 65 and over. If you look at the figures there, it shows you that since the mid-2000s, participation has nearly doubled, reflecting both financial necessity and changing attitudes towards work in later life. So retirement is no longer a sharp cut-off. It's a gradual transition. Employment typically drops from about 80% at age 60 to about 40% by 70, and many continue working well into their late 60s and beyond. Now, a key feature of our system that supports this is that New Zealand Super is not income tested. People can continue to receive the full payment when working. This design encourages continued employment, supports smoother transitions, and gives older workers flexibility to phase into retirement on their own terms. This flexibility is especially important for those who may not have accumulated significant savings or who face financial pressures due to housing costs or debt. It also helps maintain social engagement and mental well-being, which are increasingly recognised as vital components of ageing well. However, while this approach has benefits, it also raises questions about equity and sustainability. Not everyone can keep working due to health, caregiving responsibilities, or labour market barriers. So while the system supports choice, we need to ensure it also supports those who don't have choice. And as fiscal pressures grow, we may need to consider whether income testing has a role to play. This would involve trade-offs, particularly between simplicity and fiscal sustainability, and any change would need to be carefully designed to protect trust in the system and ensure that support reaches those who need it most. In short, the data show that retirement is becoming more diverse and dynamic, and our policies need to reflect that reality, supporting both those who continue working and those who need a secure income without employment. So far, we've seen what life is like in retirement and what some of the key trends in the data are. So the next step is to look forward and look at what the impact that demographic changes are likely to be having on retirement income policy. Now, I hope that it doesn't come as any surprise that the New Zealand's population is ageing. By 2050, the number of people aged 65 and over will be about 50% larger than it is today. And the working age population isn't going to grow much at all. So consequently, the proportion of people aged 65 and over in New Zealand is projected to rise from 17.8% this year to about 23.3% by 2050. The median age will rise into the mid-40s, and the older population will become more ethnically diverse, reflecting broader change in migration and in birth rates. Now, these are not just statistics, they're a fundamental shift in the structure of our society. Now, while these changes are significant and will require thoughtful policy responses, it's also worth recognising that New Zealand is relatively well positioned. To illustrate, consider old age dependency ratios, and these are simply the ratios of the population over 65 to the working age population. And our old age dependency ratio is going to increase, so the number of people aged 65 per 100 people aged 15 to 64 is projected to rise from 27.7% to 37.9%. However, this will remain in the lower part of the OECD, and interestingly, our ageing is actually going to be slower than most OECD countries, so we're actually going to be doing relatively well. Now, that actually creates another interesting dimension in that globally, the share of the population aged 65 and over is projected to increase from 10.4% this year to 16.3% by 2050. So the whole world is getting older, and that means that competition for skilled migrants is going to increase. So when people say that actually the answer will be more migration, we're going to have to understand that context, that the whole world will be getting older and we're actually going to be aging more slowly than other countries. So migration is going to be harder to pull as a policy lever. So what does this also all mean for fiscal pressures? Well, as the population ages, spending on New Zealand super and healthcare will rise significantly. No surprises there. New Zealand super currently costs just over 5% of GDP, but by 2050 that's projected to climb to nearly 7%. And health spending will also increase from 6% to over 9% of GDP, driven by longer lifespans, more complex care needs, and the growing number of older New Zealanders. Now, these are substantial increases, And it's productivity, I would argue, that will determine how manageable the path feels. If productivity growth is strong, we can maintain living standards and fund services without excessive tax hikes or debt. But if productivity stalls, the fiscal squeeze will be much tighter. Now, that is why retirement income policy can't be viewed in isolation. It's linked to labour market participation, technology adoption, and capital investment, all of which influence productivity. For example, policies that support older workers to stay in the workforce longer or that improve health outcomes can ease fiscal pressure and boost output. So the message here is clear. Demographic change is inevitable, but its impact depends on how we respond. If we invest in productivity and plan ahead, we can adapt without compromising fairness or sustainability. So now that we've looked at the demographic and fiscal pressures, let's explore how different policy responses could shape the future. And so this slide introduces a scenario framework, which is a simple but powerful way to think about the choices we face. And this was done by Adrian Katz over there, who's recently joined the Treasury. So it's great to have you here, Adrian. On the one axis, we have economic conditions, ranging from strong growth to economic headwinds. On the other hand, we have policy responses from reactive, ad hoc measures to proactive, well-planned reforms. Together, these create four distinct futures. Each quadrant represents a different combination of economic and policy settings. And each leads to very different outcomes for retirement income policy. The key insight here is that proactive policy in fair weather beats emergency moves in a storm. When we act early before fiscal pressures peak, we can make transition smoother, give people time to adjust, and build trust in the system. Reactive responses, by contrast, tend to be abrupt, harder to implement, and more likely to be reversed. This framework also helps us think about risk management. It's not just about predicting the future, it's about preparing for a range of possibilities. This means building resilience into the system, ensuring policy flexibility, and maintaining public confidence even in uncertain times. So having explored different futures that could emerge from our policy choices, let's turn to a foundational design question that underpins all scenarios, the balance between pay-as-you-go and save-as-you-go systems. Now in New Zealand Super is our pay-as-you-go pillar. It's funded by current taxpayers to support current retirees. It's simple, universal, and widely trusted, but it also concentrates demographic risk on the government's budget. As the population ages and the ratio of workers to retirees shrinks, this model becomes more fiscally demanding. On the other hand, KiwiSaver represents the save-as-you-go approach. Individuals save throughout their working lives, building up assets to draw on in retirement. This spreads the costs over time and reduces pressure on future taxpayers. It also builds resilience at the household level and supports capital market development. But save-as-you-go isn't a silver bullet. Without the right design, it can widen inequality. People with volatile incomes, low wages, or interrupted work histories, such as caregivers or the self-employed, may struggle to contribute consistently. That leads to lower balances and less security in retirement. So the answer isn't to choose one model over the other. It's about getting the balance right. We need a strong public pillar to provide a basic income floor and maintain trust, alongside a robust private savings system that supports adequacy and flexibility. This balance also helps manage intergenerational fairness. Pay-as-you-go systems rely on solidarity between generations, while save-as-you-go systems promote individual responsibility. When designed well, they can complement each other, ensuring that the system is both sustainable and equitable. In short, the future retirement policy isn't about replacing one pillar with another. It's about making sure that they work together to support a diverse and ageing population. So let's now turn to KiwiSaver, our primary save-as-you-go pillar, and explore its scale, participation patterns, and broader impact on the retirement income system. So let's start with scale, and you can see the impact of KiwiSaver in the figure there. As of March 2025, KiwiSaver had over 3.5 million members and more than 128.6 billion in assets. This growth means KiwiSaver is now a major channel for long-term savings, helping to deepen New Zealand's capital markets and support productive investment. But scale alone isn't enough. We also need to look at who is participating and how. Among employees, participation is strong. Around 90% of eligible workers contribute regularly. That's a testament to the success of the automatic enrolment and employer matching. However, the picture is very different for the self-employed. Only 44% of self-employed people contribute to KiwiSaver, and their contributions are typically lower. They also miss out on employer contributions, which means their balances grow more slowly. This gap matters, not just for individual retirement outcomes, but for system-wide equity and resilience. And this is something I'll talk a bit more about later in the presentation. But for now, let's take a closer look at how KiwiSaver's design has evolved. And this is hot off the press. So this is work that Michelle and my team has just published earlier this week or late last week. So it's very, very new. And over the past few years, we've seen an important shift in default fund settings. So since 2021, the default option has moved from conservative to balanced, and nearly half of all KiwiSaver assets are now held in growth-oriented funds. Now, this matters because over decades, even small differences in asset allocation can lead to significant differences in retirement balances. We've also seen a decline in passive default membership. Back in 2008, around 40% of members were in default funds. Today, that figure is closer to 10%. So that suggests that people are becoming more engaged with their investment choices. But it also means we need to ensure that those choices are well informed and easy to navigate. Fees have trended down, which is encouraging. The average fees as a percentage of assets has dropped from 0.95% to 0.76% over the past 5 years or so. But this decline has stalled recently, and fee dispersion remains quite wide. Some providers still charge significantly more than others, and we know that switching rates are low, even when performance differs. And finally, it's worth noting that government subsidies are modest. The annual contribution cap is $260, and the tax treatment under the PI regime is broadly neutral. So while KiwiSaver is growing in scale and impact, its effectiveness depends heavily on design choices, engagement, and ongoing support. So given the modest level of government subsidies, much of KiwiSaver's effectiveness hinges on how well its default settings guide behaviour, and in making it essential to understand the power of nudges in shaping participation. So defaults like auto-enrolment and default contribution rates help people save without requiring complex decisions. They reduce friction, overcome inertia, and guide behaviour in ways that feel effortless. Defaults also act as signals of expert guidance. People interpret them as recommendations, which increases trust and confidence in the system. In contrast, subsidies, such as tax breaks, require people to opt in, understand the rules, and take deliberate steps. That's a higher cognitive and administrative burden, and it often leads to lower uptake, especially among those with lower financial literacy or more variable incomes. International evidence strongly supports these points. In the UK, for example, when they introduced auto-enrolment, we saw a significant increase in participation in schemes. And in contrast, in Denmark, a study found that each dollar of tax subsidy increased total savings by just 1 cent. So this highlights how subsidies often benefit those who would have saved anyway. So the lesson here is clear. If we want to lift participation and adequacy, we should focus on smart defaults, automatic adjustments, and low-friction pathways, not financial incentives. Nudges are quiet but powerful tools that help people build resilience without overwhelming them. Now let's turn to one of the most persistent challenges in retirement income policy, which is the gender gaps in private savings. Now, despite the growth of KiwiSaver and improvements in fund design, women's average balances remain significantly lower than men's. This reflects a combination of factors: pay disparities, time out of the workforce, the caregiving, and part-time or low-paid work that limits contributions. In fact, 1 in 5 women don't contribute to KiwiSaver at all, and many earn below the threshold for full government matching. Now, these gaps are not just statistical. They translate into real differences in retirement outcomes, especially for single women, renters, and those without other assets. Now, as the shift insists towards greater reliance on private savings, these disparities are going to become more important. Without intervention, they will risk entrenching inequality and undermining the goals of income smoothing, poverty reduction, and fairness. Ultimately, if we want KiwiSaver to support intergenerational and gender equity, we need to design it with diverse life forces in mind, not just the standard full-time career trajectory. And as well as the gender gaps, there are also other critical dimensions of inequality in private saving: ethnicity and employment type. Let's start with ethnicity. Maori and Pacific peoples are less likely to be enrolled in KiwiSaver and, when enrolled, tend to contribute less frequently and at lower levels. This is not due to a lack of interest or financial literacy. It's often the result of lower average incomes, more variable work patterns, and lower rates of home ownership. These structural disadvantages compound over time, leading to smaller balances and greater vulnerability in retirement. Now consider the self-employed. As I mentioned earlier, only around 44% of self-employed contribute regularly to KiwiSaver. And because they don't receive employer contributions, their balances grow more slowly even when they do contribute. This group is also more likely to experience income volatility, which makes regular savings harder to sustain. Now, these gaps matter. If left unaddressed, they will translate into significant disparities in retirement incomes. Now, let's look at what recent policy changes are likely to have played a role in changing these equity outcomes in retirement. So Budget 2025 introduced two key adjustments. It reduced government contributions to KiwiSaver and it increased default contribution rates. Now, these changes are designed to lift long-term savings and improve system sustainability. Our modelling suggests that around 80% of people will see an increase in their retirement savings as a result, which is an encouraging sign that the system is moving in the right direction. But averages can mask disparities. While the overall effect is positive, the benefits are not evenly distributed. Low and middle income earners previously relied more heavily on the government contribution, which made up a meaningful share of their balance. This highlights a broader challenge. Policy changes that improve aggregate outcomes can still deepen disparities if they don't account for structural differences in income, employment, and access. And that's why monitoring distributional impacts over time is essential, not just to track progress, but to ensure that the system remains fair, inclusive, and resilient. Now, I want to talk about an example of community innovation in retirement savings, which are iwi-led savings schemes. So earlier I discussed how there are some private gaps in savings by gender, ethnicity, and employment, and how these can undermine the goals of fairness and adequacy. Maori communities in particular face distinct barriers: lower average pay, more insecure work, and shorter life expectancy. These challenges mean that mainstream retirement savings schemes like KiwiSaver may not always meet their needs. In response, some iwi have developed schemes that offer match savings, financial education, and flexible withdrawal options. These are all designed to reflect Maori values, and they operate alongside KiwiSaver, not in competition with it. This helps to fill gaps for the people who are underserved by traditional providers and helps build intergenerational wealth in culturally relevant ways. So this is a reminder that retirement income policy isn't just about averages or system-wide settings. It's about meeting people where they are. Innovation matters. These iwi-led schemes show how multiple providers and tailored approaches can strengthen the overall system by offering choice, building trust, and responding to diverse life paths. Their success also highlights the value of community governance and cultural relevance, features that can be hard to replicate in large-scale national programs. As we think about future reform, we should encourage innovation across the system, including partnerships with iwi, non-profits, and fintech providers. A more diverse provider landscape could help close savings gaps, improve engagement, and ensure that retirement income policy reflects the full range of New Zealanders' experience. So building on this theme of innovation and inclusion, it's important to remember that not all retirement income comes from private savings. While iwi-led schemes and KiwiSaver offer valuable flexibility and choice, the public pillar, particularly New Zealand Super, remains the foundation of our system as universal wage and price index and widely trusted. But as our population becomes more diverse and as gaps in private saving persist, we need to ask whether a single flat rate payment can meet the needs of all older New Zealanders. That's where Tier 2 and Tier 3 supports come in, and why design, access and responsiveness matter more than ever. As our older population becomes more diverse, it's increasingly clear that one size no longer fits all. Older New Zealanders have varied work histories, housing situations and health needs. A flat rate pension, while simple and equitable in design, doesn't always meet the needs of those facing higher living costs or greater vulnerability. That's why we're seeing a growing reliance on Tier 2 and Tier 3 supports, such as the accommodation supplement and special needs grants. In fact, around 150,000 people aged 65 and over now receive one or more of these additional payments. But uptake is uneven. Many eligible older people don't claim support, often due to low awareness, stigma, or uncertainty in engaging with work and income. The system can feel complex and intimidating, especially for those who've never interacted with it before. So these patterns highlight a key design challenge. Universal instruments like New Zealand Super are powerful for simplicity and trust, but they're not well suited to solving targeted problems. And as diversity in retirement grows, we need to think carefully about how different tools interact. Tiered supports can help address specific needs, but only if they're accessible, well understood, and designed with the realities of older New Zealanders in mind. The goal is not to replace the public pillar, but to ensure that it remains fair, inclusive, and responsive, not just in principle, but in practice. That means recognising where universal settings fall short and ensuring that complementary supports are equipped to fill the gap. Now, New Zealand Super remains the cornerstone of our retirement income system. As I've mentioned, it's simple, universal, and trusted. You'll be getting tired of me repeating that, but it is simple, universal, and trusted. But as fiscal pressures grow, we need to think carefully about how it's designed and funded. As Susan St. John has said, saying New Zealand Super is unaffordable isn't helpful, but it does reflect real trade-offs in public spending, especially as health and aged care costs rise. The challenge is to preserve trust and simplicity while adapting to changing needs. Raising the age of eligibility for New Zealand Super is often suggested as a way to reduce costs, but this approach has serious consequences. Many older New Zealanders, particularly those in physically demanding jobs with health conditions or with caregiving responsibilities, may not be able to keep working into their late 60s. For these groups, a higher eligibility age could mean increased poverty and hardship. It also risks widening inequalities, as those with higher incomes and better health are more likely to benefit while others are left behind. Targeting through income testing is another option. It could focus support on those who need it most, offering a fairer way to manage costs. But it also comes with trade-offs. Income testing can undermine the simplicity and universality that makes New Zealand Super so effective and trusted. It introduces complexity, creates disincentives to work or save, and may erode public confidence, especially if people feel the rules are unpredictable or fair. So what this highlights is that while we can think about these changes, any changes must be carefully designed, clearly communicated, and grounded in public value. The key is to avoid one-size-fits-all solutions and to ensure that any changes are understandable, equitable, and durable. Now, I've repeated those messages quite a lot throughout this presentation, and that's because one of the key dimensions of retirement income policy is the importance of trust. Trust and political consensus are the cornerstones of a stable retirement income system. Retirement income policy involves long-term promises. People plan decades ahead based on the assumption that rules will remain predictable, fair, and enduring. Sudden or unclear changes can erode confidence, discourage saving, and undermine the legitimacy of the system. That's why stability, transparency, and inclusive processes are essential. Simple, well-communicated rules help people understand what to expect. When reforms are needed, they should be signalled early, explained clearly, and sequenced carefully to protect those who might otherwise face short-term losses. International experience shows that poorly communicated or divisive reform often backfires, leading to policy reversals and long-term damage to trust. In contrast, countries that build cross-party agreement, engage the public early, and use tools like automatic adjustment and grandfathering tend to deliver reforms that endure. The key message is that trust and consensus are not optional. They underpin participation, support political stability, and give people the confidence to plan for the future. Once lost, they're difficult to rebuild, so they must be protected and nurtured at every step. So now let's turn to one of my favourite topics, the role of research and evidence. Now, reforms succeed when they're evidence-based, inclusive, and well-sequenced. That means starting with a shared purpose, clearly defining the problem, publishing options, and engaging widely to build legitimacy. This approach helps ensure that reforms are not only technically sound, but also socially accepted. Good data is also the foundation of good policy. We need better, more granular data, especially on groups who are underserved or underrepresented in the current system. That includes renters, the self-employed, Maori and Pacific people, and those with interrupted work histories. Without this, we risk designing policies that miss the mark or widen gaps. Predictability also matters. Rules should be clear and stable, with automatic adjustments and strong governance to support long-term confidence. Sudden or unclear changes erode trust and make the system prone to reversals. So as I wrap up, I just want to highlight a few key insights from today's discussion and outline where we go from here. First, New Zealand's retirement income system, anchored by New Zealand Super and KiwiSaver, it has served us well. It's simple, trusted, and relatively cost-effective by international standards. But the world is changing. We're facing demographic shifts, rising fiscal pressures, and growing diversity in how people live and work. That means the system needs to adapt. One size no longer fits all. We need to recognise the structural gaps like gender, ethnicity, housing status, and employment type, and design policies that respond to these realities. Second, trust is the anchor. People make long-term decisions based on the assumption that policy settings will remain stable and transparent. Sudden or unclear changes risk undermining that trust. So any reform must be well signalled, clearly explained, and sequenced to protect those who are most vulnerable. Third, consensus matters. Retirement income policy spans decades. If setting swings with each election, then people can't plan. That's why cross-party agreement, inclusive processes, and credible institutions are essential for durable reform. And finally, we need to learn from experience, both here and overseas. Successful reforms are evidence-based, inclusive, and well-sequenced. They balance competing objectives like affordability, poverty reduction, and work incentives without breaking trust. So the challenge ahead is clear. Keep the system simple and trusted while adapting to diversity, fiscal reality, and changing expectations. If we act early, communicate clearly, and build consensus, we can ensure that all New Zealanders can continue to retire with confidence, security, and dignity. Ngā mihi nui. Thank you. Look forward to your questions.
There's an on. Yeah. Oh, can you hear me now? Yes. Oh gosh, sorry about that. Well, thank you very much, Patrick. That was a fascinating presentation. I was asked to provide something that I found interesting or I was struck by in your presentation. And I wrote down too many notes and I don't have one. I think your message about any changes needing to be simple, the system needing to be trusted, resonated really, really well and came through very strongly. But also that retirement itself is becoming much more of a diverse experience for people as well. And the way in which we think about redesigning the system in the future needs to take account of that. I think that's a really important point. And coming from the Economic Strategy Division at the Treasury, I was also very pleased to hear you say that any sort of reform or the way you think about retirement income settings needs to be done hand in hand with how you think about economic reform more broadly to lift productivity and incomes as well. So I think that's a really critical point. We have some questions already coming through in the chat, which is great. If you are on the chat and you particularly want me to ask a question, put lots of thumbs up on it because I'm more likely to go to those. If you're in the room, please raise your hand. Someone will come round with a microphone. If you don't mind just introducing yourself, that would be really, really helpful too. And we have, I think, about half an hour possibly for questions. So plenty of get around everybody. So who would like to start? I think there in the room.
Kia ora, and my name's Jennifer Curtin. I'm from the Public Policy Institute at the University of Auckland, and really appreciated this exceptional presentation, so much in it. I'm hoping that we'll get access to the slides and the talk afterwards. I've just got 3 quick points that I'm wondering if there's more data to tell us about that you might have. The first is about young people, like keeping trust in the system and protecting it. We know that the younger generations, like the ones that are out of uni now or about to go, or that post-school, recognise that it's highly unlikely they're ever going to own a home, that they are going to be permanent renters or living with their parents. So what do you know about how young people see the role of the state and the role of KiwiSaver, etc., in their life course? The second one is about, you talked about working age population, and that the changes to that. We know that women's labour force participation is like about 10 points behind men's consistently. So it's not just about coming out, it's about these high statistically significant underutilisation rates. And so investment in good childcare or social infrastructure, as we might like to call it, is part of that sequencing and policy design process. And then the means testing or the income asset testing part. What we know from Louise Humpage's work in social policy is that as soon as you start de-universalising, I know that's not really a word, but de-universalising something that the state pays, it creates a wedge between those who support it because they get it and those who don't. So lots of questions, but if I don't get them out now, well, kia ora, thank you.
Well, thank you for those questions. I might answer them in reverse order. So remind me if I forget what they are by the time I get there. But to start with the final one, that comes up a lot. And I remember Jonathan Boston had a book, I can't quite remember the title, in the 1990s about targeting versus universality. And you often get that discussion, it's, Titmus and the gift relationship, and the idea that if people aren't receiving the benefit, they won't support it. I don't believe that. And I actually have reasons for that. I worked in the UK for quite a while, and I did quite a bit of work with British social attitudes data. And what you would see is that when you have these universal programs, you create a perception that the system's generous. And so you still have your same fiscal pressures, and you still have the need to save money. So what politicians tend to do is they tend to leave the universal programs alone, and then they tend to reduce the means tested ones, and they tend to become more miserly. And that's certainly what happened in the UK. And so that would be my concern. And so I think it's a bit more subtle than to say, oh, we need to, have everyone sort of receiving assistance because then everyone will buy into the system and support it. I think actually, if people see it going to people who don't need it, they start to question the system as a whole, and that can kind of create a, sort of political incentive to have means testing. And I think that's why someone like Susan St. John, who's not on the right of the spectrum, I would say, I don't know if she's watching, I'm sure she won't mind me saying that, is a supporter of income testing. And because she works a lot with looking at child poverty and working families and the incredible amount of means testing that takes place around children and working age people. And we don't have anything nearly the same in terms of the over 65 population. So I think there's a real issue there. Your first question, I can't remember what the second one was. I'll go to your first question, was around young people. So we focus a lot on young people at the Retirement Commission. They're one of our target groups because, sort of the goal to increase savings. We actually are, I don't know if I'm allowed to say this here, but we are starting a project soon on younger people's voices to try and understand their perspective a bit more. And as part of the review that we're doing this year, we actually had a session with a youth parliament. And so that was really interesting. And I'd have to say what struck me is that they were much more open to discussing changes to settings. They were very happy to have those conversations. They did bring quite fresh thinking to it. So they discussed whether they increase the age of eligibility for New Zealand Super, and they were kind of split 50-50 at first. And then they ended up having about 2 hours of discussion and ended up supporting it as long as there were sufficient protections and grandfathering for people who needed it. And so they were able to have that discussion, and if you gave them the evidence and the facts, they were very comfortable with approaching policy change. So maybe it's because for them it's further off and there's not the same sort of anxiety of changing entitlements. So I feel that the younger people are probably a bit more open to thinking about policy change. And I've forgotten what your middle question was.
Oh, just the life course around women's labour
Yes.
force participation and underutilisation and the lack of sort of affordable support to continue working.
Yeah, the challenge we face at the Retirement Commission is you've got to ask what are the levers in the retirement income policy space. So we did in our 22 review of retirement income policy, there was a lot of a focus on the gender pay gap and measuring that and closing that, but we don't actually have levers. So this is why we're very focused on the KiwiSaver dimension, and particularly KiwiSaver contributions around parental leave. We think that's a key moment where we could do more and quite effectively not close, but help reduce some of those gaps.
Thanks very much, Patrick. We're just having a little bit of a trouble with the Q&A function online, but I do actually have a question from Susan St. John.
All right.
It's along similar lines, so I might as well just ask it now. So it's just another question. Could the employer contribution be made compulsory so that women and others who can't afford to keep up their contributions are not paid less in total than others?
Compulsion. We haven't generally supported compulsion at the Retirement Commission. What is interesting though is, and I think this is to sort of generalise from Susan's question a little bit, as contribution rates go up, then I do think it is probably a question that we're going to have to think about a little bit harder. The reason we don't support compulsion at the Retirement Commission is we've already got 90% wage and salary earners contributing, and so compulsion wouldn't really gain you much more. And the work that Adrian did looking at the Australian Superannuation Guarantee, we actually had broadly similar coverage rates. So you're not going to get much more from having a compulsory system. The question is, when you move from, say, 3+3 to 4+4, or even if you go higher to, say, 5+5, the incentives do change. And so things like compulsion, things like the use of total REM strategies and firms remuneration approaches, these become much more salient issues. And so I would say if contribution rates go up, we may have to look at compulsion, and we may have to look at things like firms remuneration strategies and the use of total REM policies, those sorts of issues. And we also would have to have a good look at things like savings suspensions and hardship withdrawals. So, I think, there's a whole bundle of things. So I wouldn't just see compulsion, in isolation.
Thank you very much. We'll go to the back of the room now. Thank you.
Thank you again, Patrick. I'm John Canton. I'm going to take a little bit of inspiration from Jennifer and ask 3 questions. One is on the old age dependency ratio, which seems to work simply on age. But as you've said, there's a significant participation for those more than 65. Does that change the ratio when you wait for those over 65 working? Secondly, the NZ Super Fund, the Cullen Fund, looks like a save as you go. How does that factor into your thinking? And the third is possibly one for the Treasury team. I understand they have a model which you can factor in a policy change, and it was done for the pay equity changes, for example. It gives you a fiscal cost for tax offset, a GDP effect. My interest is in what would happen if we simply turned off NZ Super and what that would look like, just to give us a base to say what does it contribute to the economy and our settings currently. I don't think you need to answer that one though. You might have a go at the other 2.
So old age dependency ratio. So you're right. It's a measurement thing, isn't it? But work that Adrian did. So this, I keep referring to Adrian's paper. This is Adrian's Aotearoa New Zealand in 2050. It's on the NZIR website and also on our website. It's well worth a look. And Adrian looked at the sensitivity of the old age dependency ratio to change, extending working lives, and it doesn't really change the story that much. There is some impact, but it's not going to have a huge change. I won't answer the question about the Treasury modelling. And what was your other question?
The second was whether
the
the super
super
fund
fund.
is save as you go.
Yes, that's right. Yes, so it is definitely a save as you go pillar. And so one option is whether we put more into sort of the KiwiSaver as a pillar of save as you go, or you could, pre-fund via the New Zealand Super Fund. So those are two things that are both, there. I guess the advantage of KiwiSaver is that it is individual accounts and it is tied to sort of individuals' retirement incomes, and it's much more of that income smoothing at an individual level. So there's quite a different policy rationale for KiwiSaver versus the New Zealand Super Fund, which is much more about smoothing the cost of New Zealand Super.
Thank you. And I'm not going to attempt to answer the modelling question on behalf of Treasury either. I apologise. We do have quite a lot of new and novel modelling going into our long-term fiscal statement, but we have to have a chat with people about that as well too. There's just a question online from Amy Russell from the Treasury, who says, thanks for noting the interdependence of retirement savings settings and housing. And is there anything further you'd like to elaborate on there?
Well, housing is an interesting one. It's a very big policy area at the moment, and it's an area where it shows that actually policy changes can have an impact. And I guess for us, we are a bit more focused on sort of the micro issues. So we're very interested in not just the level of housing, but obviously if housing is available, particularly issues around aged care and in the retirement village space, but also whether private landlords sort of aware of the, sort of the impending change in the sort of rental market. So we've done quite a lot of work in this space. In fact, one of our statutory functions is in the retirement village space. So we do a lot of thinking about housing. So yes, I just agree with Amy. It's definitely an important issue going forward. In terms of the retirement income policy, it's probably more context because it really what it does is it changes need. But so it's a slightly different policy area. I didn't really answer the question at all. But yeah.
That's very helpful. Thank you. Who in the room?
Hi, I'm Dan Stoner from Taylor Fry and the Society of Actuaries. Just picking up on one of your slides that showed an increasing number of retirees accessing welfare, Tier 2 and Tier 3 benefits. And I'm just thinking about the flip side of retirement income being retirement expenditure. And the fact that for retirees, items like rates, insurance, utilities like power, all a significant part of their expenditure profile, and they've all been inflating at fast rates in the recent past, with a reasonable suspicion that will continue into the future, and put pressure on retirement incomes. So it's more of an observation of a question, but I agree with the point that design of those policy settings of Tier 2 and Tier 3 benefits in the welfare system, particularly accommodation supplement, is going to be important for retirement income policy more generally.
Yeah, I can. Well, thanks, Dan. I guess there's two things to know. I guess it really is that interaction between the universal New Zealand Super and the targeted Tier 2 and Tier 3. And really making sure we've got that balance right. Now, that's quite a difficult question to raise. People who know about income transfer policy will understand, if there's a rebalancing there between those things. And I personally, not speaking from the Retirement Commission's view, would prefer more focus on the Tier 2 and Tier 3 and maybe less on the New Zealand Super. And also your question about income. So understanding what that income in retirement needs to be and what provides a decent standard of living and replacement rates is a critical question. I know that you and the REIC, the Retirement Income Interest Group, and the Society of Actuaries are doing a lot of thinking about this. And that's really important because as we think about, KiwiSaver settings, we've just gone to 4+4, but, and that for many people, that will give you a replacement rate of about 70%. But for others, people who have broken career histories or it may not be enough. So we might need to be thinking about different kind of KiwiSaver contribution rates. So all of these things, all of these settings sort of are intertwined. So, understanding incomes in retirement is really important for when we're thinking about how we're setting KiwiSaver contribution rates.
That's great, thank you. Question from Neil Madgwick. Can you comment on the pros and cons of KiwiSaver compared with the Australian approach that sees many Australians being able to retire with substantial retirement savings and at the same time providing a large pool of funds available for long-term investment in the economy?
Yes, again, so Adrian wrote another paper for us comparing New Zealand and Australia, which is definitely well worth a look. And it also, there's an earlier paper by, I think, Guest, that also compared New Zealand and Australia. So this has been a topic that's been researched quite a lot. And I mean, obviously it's true, and they have much more of a save as you go approach in Australia than in New Zealand. But, you know, it's not a silver bullet in the sense that actually a contributory system, what you can get out will only depend on what you can put in. So if you're not earning a lot in the labour market, or if you have a broken period of work history because you're taking time out for caregiving, then you're going to be disadvantaged in a contributory system. And so that's the advantage of the New Zealand super approach, where it's much more of a levelling type of system. So there's much more, it's much fairer for women, and it's much fairer for sort of lower income people. So while the Australian system obviously does mean people have higher retirement savings and there's, you know, deeper capital markets and all of that, you've got to understand that there's also an trade-off there with the sort of the equity or the fairness. So it's about that balance that we strike. And I actually think New Zealand is a different country to Australia, and we do actually have different values. And I actually think having that pay-as-you-go pillar is quite important to New Zealanders. So I can't see us moving towards, say, a Singaporean model, which is another extreme. I think we're always going to have a New Zealand super in New Zealand.
Thank you. Anyone else in the room? Sujin?
Hi, Patrick. I'm Sujin from ANI. Thanks for the talk. And actually, recently I read an article, I think it's actually in Singapore, Malaysia, and they talk about actually expenditure pattern actually probably plays a bigger role than the income itself on average. And I mean, I'm not sure like how much policy or what kind of policy can really influence like how people spend their money, but I'm just thinking like, is there any insights in New Zealand about that? I mean, if that's the case, at least raise the public awareness probably is quite important.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I mean, I understanding because, you know, one of the purposes of retirement income policy is to smooth income over time. Well, we're actually really to smooth consumption over your life cycle, isn't it? So understanding expenditure in retirement is really important, because that's kind of the key role for one of the key roles for retirement income policy. I guess what we see through our work is people being reluctant to draw down wealth. It's really interesting, actually, people going into retirement and not drawing down their KiwiSaver, and there's a real a risk aversion there, and you can understand that because you can only, once it's gone, it's gone. You know, they're all saying you can only retire once, but you know, in retirement you're making decisions and you can't reverse them. So it's a really difficult decision. So there's a lot of concern around drawing down wealth. So we're actually a bit concerned that people are maybe not drawing down their KiwiSaver balances and basically not spending it and sacrificing their well-being in retirement, you know, for what? You know, just for a bequest. But there we are.
There's a very similar question, I think, on the chat. Sorry, and I think this might be still a little bit of problems with the chat and the QA, so I've swatched over to the chat just to check there's nothing there. But it is around this decumulation point and whether there's a role for the government to help people manage the spending down of their savings in retirement.
Yeah, well, decumulation, it's funny, it's such a technical word. I personally quite like it, but common people tell us never to use that word. But it is such an important part of the conversation, and we're so focused on the accumulation part of the sort of puzzle, and we provide so little focus on the decumulation. So almost every review of retirement income policy bangs on about decumulation and how more can be done. As the Commission, we've recently released a calculator that it takes these rules of thumb around how to draw down your wealth. And, you know, I've got what I called it. Retirement income navigator. So that's on our website. So we're trying to provide more advice in this space, but I think it's a particularly underserviced part of like the financial capability market is around decumulation, and I'd love to see much more focus on that. Particularly, I mean, if you've got large balances, there's always going to be an incentive for providers to provide you with services. But, you know, there is quite significant gaps for people with smaller balances and stuff around getting good financial advice around decumulation. So I'd love to see more in that particular space. In terms of the role of government, I probably would stop there. I know Susan's probably online, so she might have comments on this, but I don't really support the idea of a government annuity. I think, well, when we've got New Zealand superannuation, you don't really need it, because New Zealand super effectively is, you could effectively describe it as a government annuity. It's worth, when someone's retiring, it's worth about $500,000 to you in retirement. So if you're going to retire and live to about 90, the value of your New Zealand super is equivalent to having $500,000 in the bank. So we've basically got a government provided annuity we call New Zealand super. So I wouldn't, you know, sort of argue for, you know, a sort of Kiwi spend or something, an annuity product like that.
Thank you. In the room, I think Daisy, you had a question before.
Only if there's no one else. Just don't want to crowd out.
Kia ora, Patrick. You know me, I'm Daisy Anapong from the Treasury, and I just can't say kind of accolades enough really for the amazing work that you're doing at the Retirement Commission to everyone and all the work that you've commissioned. You've been really thoughtful about that, excited about the youth study coming through. Two things for me from the presentation, just wondering if you want to expand a little bit on the early withdrawal of superannuation in other countries. I've not seen that before, so that's quite an interesting idea. Just if you can expand a bit. And then the other one was iwi schemes, which is really fascinating, especially given the growth of the Māori economy and their extent of wealth and the intergenerational aspects as well, that you know, often the assets are held in long-term assets, like for these future generations, but you know, what about the current ones? Really fascinating. Thanks, Patrick.
Yeah, just to start on the iwi schemes, I agree. I think that is fascinating, and it's really what's really interesting to me about it is we see an issue in retirement income policy, like in savings, and we think, oh well, we've got to change KiwiSaver, or we've got to tinker with KiwiSaver. And I think what the iwi schemes tell me is that actually KiwiSaver is good for a particular purpose, and it's good, you know, for a particular group of people. But what's really important is making sure we've got that whole sort of functioning market of providers. So, you know, it's not just KiwiSaver providers. We should be thinking about iwi providers, and also if there's we've been talking a lot about the self-employed, for example, and one of the issues there is the challenge of locking the funds in, because if you're self-employed, your income's so variable. So whether actually there's products there that are more suited to the self-employed, which are more about having liquid savings rather than illiquid savings. And so, you know, I think that for me, the iwi schemes, the importance of that is it shows the value of having a range of providers, or that diversity of supply. So there's that. And I've forgotten what your first question was.
The early withdrawal of the superannuation overseas.
Well, I guess, well, there's two. I'm not sure in the slide where I mentioned. No, I didn't mention that slide. I'm not so keen on the early withdrawal, because the issue with the early withdrawal is you've got to think who's going to benefit from it. It's basically the people who already have choice anyway. So it doesn't seem, you might save a bit of money, but you're basically only benefiting the people who actually would have the choice in order to delay taking up New Zealand super. So it doesn't seem like a particularly fair
I thought
approach.
in your presentation you were saying the
Yes, no.
for people who can't work.
Oh, so that's a different thing. So no.
Sorry, maybe
the other thing would be in countries, and this is on our work plan for next year, is to look more into sort of overseas experiences of where countries have allowed people, you know, if you're come from a certain occupational group, or you have medical reasons, being able to access benefits early. Yeah. So so it's that. So I think it's the early access for people under quite stringent grounds that we're interested in exploring, because if the age of eligibility was to increase, for example, you would have to have something in place to protect people, because there are people who would be hurt by that policy. So you would have to think about what instruments or what levers are there to protect them. And so we're keen to look overseas to see what's been done in that space.
Perhaps slightly along those lines of the transition, there's a question from Gerald Monet in the chat, which is around comparisons to Australia once again. But it says, I think your slide showed that Australia's projected expenditure on public pension falling to one of the lowest fractions of GDP across the OECD. As I understand it, they have increasingly relied on employer-based pension schemes to finance retirement, and they have income and asset testing have had a massive impact on what's actually paid out, presumably by the government, by way of their public age pensions to retirees. And that's an approach that's been built over time. Is there anything, would it be feasible to do something similar to that in New Zealand? And what would be some of the downsides of that?
Well, I think the thing with the Australian system that we shouldn't forget is the tax subsidies. So they're spending as much on their tax subsidies as they are on their age pension. And so while their spending on the age pension is very low, you've got to consider that, it's also a lot of spending through the tax system. And that's it's not particularly fair. We know that people who tend to benefit the most from tax subsidies tend to be higher income earners and those sorts of things. So, taken as a whole, the Australian system is more expensive than maybe that graph shows, but overall it's still a relatively cheap system. But those points I raised earlier about that trade-off between the fairness in a way of a pay-as-you-go system versus in a way the efficiency of a save-as-you-go system, you kind of can't get away from that sort of trade-off. So I just think I just can't see us going as far as Australia and having a means-tested and sort of age pension. And I think also if you look at the Australian tax system, I really wouldn't want their tax system over here. You see what a political football it is and the complexities that creates and the complexities. So I actually think our system overall is simpler and fairer and it's relatively cost effective.
Thank you. Oh, another question down the back of the room there. Thank you.
So much follow up. Imagine you end up with the perfect retirement income policy.
Yeah.
What's your sense of bipartisan political acceptance of that policy and the sustainability of it? Is it something you think everybody's bought into, or will that just be another political vote catcher at the next election one way or the other?
It's hard in an MMP environment where every vote counts. So there's always going to be an incentive for people to sort of focus on differences and stuff. We have done it before in New Zealand, so we had the Accord in the 1990s. So obviously a very different environment. But I would hope that we can generate some sort of cross-party consensus. I think we need to. The challenge will be people might agree on the ends or the objectives, but they might disagree on the means. So there's going to have to be a question of whether we can disentangle some of that. So, it wouldn't be a question for me to say this is what the retirement income system should look like, and therefore try and build a consensus around it. You'd have to go in the other direction, and you'd have to try and understand what people's concerns were and why people were sort of reaching the views that they were, and then see if you can reach common ground that way, and then maybe build the system up from there. And I would say, because, my reflection of being in this role is that I think that people on the left of the spectrum need to understand that it's about choices, and there are actually important choices in terms of what the government is spending its money on, and it's really difficult to keep crowding out spending in some areas when we're spending more and more on New Zealand super. And people on the right need to understand it's about distribution, that it isn't just a question of putting up the age of eligibility and then everything fits, because you've still got these gaps in savings. You're still going to have these people who can't work for longer. So we've really got to understand those distributional questions. So I think there's a spot between there. So if both sides can appreciate that we've got to recognise choices are real and that distribution is important, then I think we're going to have a much better chance at generating some sort of consensus.
Thanks, Patrick. Just apologise to anyone online. I am having a bit of trouble navigating through the online questions, so if I am missing anyone, I apologise. It's not deliberate. I do have a question here from Tim Hughes, which is, do you have a perspective on how wider calls on KiwiSaver balances can be managed over time for stability, especially as those balances grow? So there we're thinking about things, either hardship, house purchases, business investments potentially.
Nice. I'm not going to talk about farms. A few people might know, but anyway, no, this is one of the, like, this is the point of the presentation is retirement income policy. We're talking about decades long stuff here, and you just can't have a KiwiSaver scheme that kind of chases every passing bus. So it's really important to have, really clear principles, really understand what the scheme is for, and understand that KiwiSaver is not everything. That KiwiSaver is here to help people save for their retirement or buy their first home. And that's it. So for other schemes, you might look at, say, iwi schemes, or you might think about sidecar type models, or there might be other financial products that we could develop, or we could see that we could support being developed that might be able to help. But KiwiSaver has a role, and I think we should just kind of stick to it.
Are there any other questions in the room? We've probably got about another 5 minutes worth of questions to go. Anyone else in the room? Chris? Let's go first.
Hi, I'm Roger Hernard. Used to be with the Retirement Commission and with the Treasury, but it was a long time ago. My question, Patrick, first of all, I think it was an excellent presentation. Well done. You haven't mentioned anything about unit of analysis in the sense that when you're looking at poverty, avoiding hardship and poverty, it's almost inevitable you're going to include a household or family unit as part of the analysis. And yet the rest of the talk has all been on individual, basically, and focusing on what the individual needs. And I'm very conscious that over the life cycle, people change from one status to another, either through going from renters to homeowners or back, and family units change. You could add grandchildren, caring, or divorce, widowhood, remarriage even. So I'm wondering, have you got any comments on how those interactions should work?
Well, thanks, Roger. Yes, no, that's a very insightful question. It's a challenge, isn't it? I guess KiwiSaver, it is, like market wages are worked out on an individual basis. So KiwiSaver kind of maps that, and it's kind of really is an individual product. I guess looking at more the household and income sharing, that's where the role of New Zealand Super becomes important. And so we've got that as a tool that can allow recognising those variations in expenditure and need. So I kind of see that, but the system, it's always going to be a bit awkward, isn't it? Because we're dealing with basically a contributory system based on what people are earning, which will be on an individual basis, and then a sort of a welfare system which does recognise, sort of the income sharing unit and the family and the household and all of that. So that's always going to be an issue in the retirement system. And I just think what that reinforces is the value in having both KiwiSaver and that public pillar, the New Zealand Super and all the Tier 2 and Tier 3 benefits. So yeah.
Hi, Chris Thompson from the Treasury. You mentioned the importance of productivity in your talk, and totally on board with the importance of improving the productivity of the New Zealand economy. I just wonder about the extent to which it will help with the fiscal costs of New Zealand Super, on the grounds that if productivity improves, wages increase, and there's a 66% wage floor. So you're kind of chasing your tail when it comes to the cost of super.
Absolutely. I was wondering if someone would pick that up. I mean, if you do use Matt Bell's spreadsheet, then that's what you find out. I guess the issue there, though, is well-being's higher. So you might be, sort of spending more, but but the value of New Zealand Super is going to be higher than if wages weren't growing as fast as otherwise. So in a way, and what it does allow you to do is say maybe in an arithmetic sense, that's what you said is absolutely true. But in a practical sense, if you have higher productivity, it gives future governments more choice. And so you might not necessarily need to increase New Zealand Super as high as you would otherwise in order to achieve a certain level of well-being, if you know what I mean. So it gives you more choice, and it allows you to reach that higher sort of standard of living by spending less. But you're not going to see that in a sort of an arithmetic model, which is where basically you get an increase in wages and fiscal costs will just go up automatically. But even in that case, you've just got to look at the value of New Zealand super in those two scenarios, and the value will be higher. So that's telling you that there's some sort of higher well-being attached to that.
Thank you. We probably have time for one last question, if anybody would like to take that. Checking online, sorry.
If you have all the power, what's the first thing you want to change?
Huh?
Great. The vote online, in case you didn't hear it, is if you had all the power and you could make the choices, what is the one thing that you would like to change, Patrick Nolan?
Well, look, Rodney Porter and I were discussing this earlier, and I told him what I would do, but I'm not allowed to say it publicly. We all have bosses. I think there's a question about what settings I'd introduce, and to be honest, I think there's quite clearly what we should be doing with the retirement income system. There's some clear policy recs there. I think the other one would be that political consensus. I just wish that we could discuss this. It's again a Michael Cullen quote with more light and less heat. It would be good if we could just have a more open discussion on this. Sometimes when I give talks like this, I use the case of the New Zealand cricket team in the 1990s and how Australian commentators would always come on and they'd talk about their team's ability to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory. And I just wonder, that would be my worry, is that we will do that with our retirement income system. We're actually in a relatively good position in terms of our demographics. We've got a good system. It's simple, it's coherent, it's relatively cost effective, but it does need to change. So I would hope that we can make that change in the right way and that we just don't pull random levers and that we just don't do silly things.
Thank you very much, Patrick. I think we'll call it shots there with the don't do dumb stuff, which seems to be a really important message for all of us as well too, and I think it's well used. So thank you very much for joining us today and also taking the time to share your knowledge and thoughts with us as well, and very interesting insights in there as well too. And also thanks to all of you in the room who dared to go out in the cold to join us today, and those of you online for joining the debate as well too, and apologies for a few of the technical issues at the beginning as well too. Just want to let you all know we do have some more brilliant speakers still coming up in this seminar series for the remainder of the year. In September we have a further 2 presenters. Dwayne Farmer, Professor of Mathematics and Director of Complexity Economics at Oxford University, and also Michael Keane, former Deputy Director of the Fiscal Affairs Department at the IMF, and also a renowned expert in tax policy and administration. So if you are interested in any of those new lectures, you can register for them via the Treasury website or on Eventbrite. And so now I'd just like to close with a karakia. Piki te kaha, piki te ora, piki te wairoa. Yay. Thank you very much, everyone, for attending. We really appreciate it. Safe travels back to wherever you're going next. Mā te wā. Thank you.
On the word.